you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Dina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And it's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you today. The panel, there are three of us on the panel, and we're each going to give a separate talk on the theme of law and the circular economy transition with and without justice. So I'm going to go first. I'm Rosalind Malcolm from the University of Surrey in the UK, and I'm going to be followed by Katrien Steemans from the University of Copenhagen, and then Fiea Lesniewska from, again from the University of Surrey, will conclude the three talks. You're very welcome to ask questions after each talk. That would be nice. Or if you prefer to put questions in the chat. When we've finished our talks and any questions as we go along, we do have a few questions that we would like you to think about as well. So we'll come to that at the very end. But our three talks, they are, sorry, just get rid of that message. The three talks this morning are going to be, first of all, from myself around the concept of the circular economy, what we mean by it, what its objectives might be and its limitations, and how it sits within the wider context. Then Katrien is going to give some examples of interventions around law and policy for managing waste, so the core of the circular economy. And Fiea then will conclude by talking, this is the justice or no justice dimensions embedded in the whole circular economy related laws, an area that we feel is neglected. So this is my talk, the very first one. So I'm going to give a broad introduction to what we're talking about. And there are three areas that I'm focusing on. And of course, we are focusing on waste law, which is very much at the core of the problem for our pollution and so on. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, how can we eliminate waste and what legal tools could we design to prevent waste and pollution and stimulate an economy where materials are retained as stock. And thirdly, to consider how can we move forward from that? How can we influence policymakers to implement those legal tools? And I should say I'm based here at the Surrey Centre for International and Environmental Law, but I've been working very much recently in the context of plastics, and I co-direct the governing plastics network that you can see there, jointly with the University of Nairobi in Kenya. So, designing law to prevent the ecological harm caused by waste. And one of the concerns as lawyers that we often have is that very often the notion of what laws should we use are left to the end, that the processes are considered, the technical side is considered, the design side is considered, and law can often be left as an afterthought. But it seems critical to us that we need to think at the beginning about the laws that we need to. We need to use law as a driver for the to manage this, to implement the problems. If we don't connect the design of the law to the management of the problem, then we'll be left with a situation when law can potentially be a barrier because it isn't designed to fit with what we need in the circumstances. So what are the key points here when we're designing law? As lawyers, we tend to think very much in terms of liability, moving from and what we need to think is primarily in terms of prevention. So that's the first point to make. The second point is to eliminate the concept of waste. Now, this is aspirational, I think, but it's a good aspiration and one that we should feature as at the core of our design, that waste should almost become a word that is meaningless in the future, that perhaps in generations to come, they'll say, what is that thing that you called waste? That there is no longer a concept of something that's waste. Everything has a purpose, has a use, and can be reused in some way. And then, of course, to design those legal tools to prevent waste and pollution and stimulate the economy, where we don't let things leak into the environment, but where we hold them within that economy. So prevention and not liability. I mean, this is, you know, it's so often the scene where we see the harm that is done, and it's just too late. At that point, you know, the problem of the plastic jar in the ocean, it's too late. We've let the damage happen, and you know, we just simply need to move our focus to the preventative stage. And of course, that's embedded in many policies at all different levels and in all different contexts. But it's one that really needs to be at the core of what we do, and needs to be something that we address, that we are forward-looking, we anticipate, we don't wait for the harm to occur. And in doing that, we will then be able to drive an economy where we retain our stocks of materials, and we do not allow them to leak into the environment. And there are 4 points here that I want to make. First of all, and this is nothing novel, nothing new to you, all our laws at the moment are mainly based on an industrial linear economy, the sort of economy where we take from the earth, we make things, and then we throw them away. And of course, in many respects, that's a simplistic way. There are many initiatives going on, and Katrine will talk about some of the laws that are in existence at the moment. But those are laws that are trying to shift from this. You know, this whole policy shift that we're looking for is from laws that are doing this. They are flatlining laws at the moment. They are at the root of the problem. And what we need is to replace that with a system where we no longer look at the flows of material, the flows of energy through the system, but where we replace that by stocks of assets, whether those are products or the materials themselves, where waste becomes an input in the system. So it's retaining those stocks at the center of the economy and not allowing them to leak or escape into the environment. And then thirdly, we need to think about, in our preventative fashion, we need to think about the whole life cycle of a product. Our linear economy laws tend to think about points of impact during the process. So we have lots of laws that are concerned with the extraction of resources. We have lots of laws that are concerned with the manufacture of products. And then there tends to be a little bit of a gap, and we get to the end and we have more laws that think about what to do with something once it's become waste, once it is end of life. So those laws are structured on the flatlining basis. And in order to promote this shift from that approach, we need to think about the product itself and the life cycle of the product before, you know, while it's still a twinkle in our eye, before we've even manufactured it. And then, of course, we need to ask, once we've developed those laws, how do we use the law to achieve this? So in an economy where we are looking, where we have prevention of harm at the core of it, this is an economy that is not about primary manufacturing, but it's one based on services, where it's based on the performance of services to achieve that retention of materials within the economy. And prevention of harm then is key. So it will be an economy where it is largely based on the provision of services rather than the selling of new goods. So the services that we're looking to develop and build, where people are performing those services, will be related to things like the reuse of materials and products, or the remanufacturing of products. So we'll be concerned with what we can do with something before it gets into that final downstream phase of the life cycle. We'll be seeking to block the gate to that downstream phase and make the product and the material that's part of that product stay within the economy at that point and be reused or remanufactured. And clearly there are many different ways in which that can happen. It can be about looking at the design phase of the project. What can we do to extend its service life, rather than intensifying the flow of materials? And then the final point there, this depends on labour. This is about an economy that's based on the performance of services by us, by people. So there are very many implications for the use of labour here, rather than the use of energy or the use of virgin materials. So putting services into the system as one of the stocks in the system means that there are human interactions involved with the reuse of products, the remanufacture of products, the design of products. So just to emphasize those 2 points, in a linear economy, the current models, the economic and business models, focus on flows. So the materials, the products flow round the economy and flow through the economy. They flow into it and out of it. And when they flow out of it, they flow into the environment. They escape from that economic loop. And it does that, it focuses and it measures those flows. It uses tools like GDP or added value, where the importance of the flow is what is counted. And that is what is measured, and it's considered to be a good thing to have GDP. It's measuring something that is fundamentally flawed in terms of its environmental impacts, rather than prioritising the stock themselves, the quality, the value, and the use of the stock, and measuring that. So what we're looking at, what we're seeking to achieve through the design of laws, is an economy where stock is retained. And of course, to do that is a really major rethink of public policy and its implications on the private sector. And you know, there is no underplaying the fact that this is a very, very major endeavour that requires many people to be thinking about this and working towards this. It's a socio-technocratic approach. It involves technology, clearly, the importance of eco-design, but it also has the human interaction, which starts to bring us towards the justice element. It involves people as part of the players, key players, in the performance of services in relation to stocks, materials, products. So there are social welfare implications, employment implications, and all moving towards a joined up approach to sustainability. Katrine will look at this life cycle in a little bit more detail, but this is taken from a UNEP paper, one of the working documents at the International Negotiating Committee, the first one for the Global Plastics Treaty, as an example of how we can address the life cycle. And you can take each point, you can take from the extraction here through to the feedstocks, the processing, the design, the distribution, the use, the collection, the waste management, and out. And here it goes out into the economy and out of the economy. And what we're seeking to do is join up at this point, and maybe at earlier points, to hold it within the economy, whether it's reuse at different levels, whether it's repair, refurbishment, recycling, keeping it within that economy. And to do that requires forensic application of detail. It's looking at each point and asking, what are the laws that are the challenges, that are barriers? What are the priorities and needs here at each point of the life cycle? And examining each legal instrument and saying, how can we redesign those in order to keep those, in this case, the plastics, within the circle? So the problem is to identify and evaluate those legal tools for the management of waste, which are most effective in stimulating the economy where materials are retained. And then, and it's a big and then, to implement and enforce them. What's our end point for all this? Well, I take a quote from my colleague here at Surrey, Tim Jackson, it's to live well within a finite planet. You know, that is our overarching endpoint. It's our definition of sustainability. And that's where we're seeking this major public policy shift in order to achieve that. That's our objective. And who is to live well? Humans, everybody, the environment, all elements of the environment. But to do that, we've got to recognise the nature of the planet as being finite and ensure that our materials and stocks and our impact on it is kept within those constraints. So that's the end of my talk, the first talk here. I'm happy to take questions. I mean, I can just, do encourage you to join the Governing Plastics Network. You can go to the website. We have a few hundred members on the network. We put out a video or a policy brief every week. We blog from time to time. So I do encourage you to join that. But let me stop there and invite you to ask any questions at this point. I will stop sharing my screen just to check whether we have any questions in the chat or if anyone would like to raise a hand. See anyone, Dina? Can you? I don't think we've got any questions.
I don't think we've got any questions yet.
Okay. Well, thank you for listening.
They're overwhelmed with the challenge that you set out.
Oh, yes. I realised it's no small dice, is it? Yeah, that we're rolling.
Yeah. we're going to make it harder.
Yes. So moving onwards and upwards, I hope. I'm going to invite Katrine to share her screen now.
Hopefully everyone can see that now. Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, great. Okay,
so over to you, Katrine.
Thank you. Yep, so I will focus on some of the legal and policy interventions which can manage these unsustainable amounts of waste. So Rosalind concluded by identifying the endpoint. So the key question is really, how can we get to the endpoint? And our focus, as we've mentioned a few times, is on the law. Essentially, the law has been widely recognized both in the literature, but also by practitioners as a necessary tool to enable a more rapid transition to a circular economy. And my focus for the next 15 to 20 minutes is to provide some of the examples that currently exist or can be introduced in order to support such transitions. My examples draw from both the global south and north, but my research and knowledge is mainly situated within the European Union. So my examples are and knowledge is skewed towards those jurisdictions. So if you only take away 3 things from the next 15 to 20 minutes, I hope it's these 3 things. And it's really that there's no silver law bullet for the circular economy. There is no single approach or law that will help with this systemic shift that Rosalind has talked about. But the good news is that lots of laws to incentivize circular economy principles already exist and are being implemented, though it comes with the caveat that none are yet causing the systemic shift that is needed. And then finally, as Rosalind has also already highlighted, that laws need to be aimed at the entire life cycle of products if we are to transition to a circular economy and not just at the waste phase. So when thinking about circular economy in the law, there are many ways in which you could think about and categorizing the laws that exist. This is just one attempt to categorize, and it's based on Fie's and my attempt that's set out in our book on circular economy in the law. We essentially distinguish between 3 categories of laws. Laws explicitly labeled as circular economy laws, laws underpin embodying or implementing circular economy principles, but not introduced as circular economy laws per se. And then finally, laws impacting the circular economy more widely. So starting with the first category, these are exactly what the label says. These are laws that have the circular economy or a synonymous term in their name. Yeah, and these are generally more recent examples. I've listed some on the slide. So you do have some that date back for more than 2 decades, but there's China's Circular Economy Promotion Law from 2008, France's Anti-Waste and Circular Economy Law from 2020, and Mexico's General Circular Economy Law 2021. And these laws and policies don't just exist at national level, but there's also examples of laws and policies at supranational or subnational level. So one of the often cited ones is the EU's Circular Economy Action Plan, which has been around for over or almost a decade now, with its most recent iteration from 2020, but also subnational initiatives by cities implementing policies themselves. So for example, the Amsterdam Circular Strategy, Circular Glasgow, and London Circular Economy route map. The issue with these current laws, though, is that their meta-narratives are too narrowly construed by predominantly focusing on environmental dimensions of waste reuse, recycling, and other recovery. So at this stage, it's arguably already too late because the waste has already been produced. So a shift is needed to really focus on that entire life cycle of products. And they also often have caveats in them that say that the circular economy should only be pursued where economically feasible or makes economic sense. So that's quite a hefty caveat. The second category captures those laws that help implement principles of circular economies implicitly or explicitly. So this can be a result of a explicitly labeled circular economy law that identifies the need to implement another law to help support its aims, or it could be as a result of a law that's not explicitly labeled as a circular economy, but that links to it. So for example, the EU Waste Framework Directive is a waste law, and in its aim, it links to the objectives of a circular economy. There are different measures that can be used to support such aims, and one way of thinking about them is either as market-based measures or command and control measures. Market-based measures aim to incentivize behavioral change of a producer or consumer by increasing the price of products or raising revenues for the purpose of specific environmental or general uses. So examples include environmental taxation or container deposit schemes. Each of these measures have their own benefits and issues. So for example, landfill taxes can reduce environmental effects with quite a low impact on GDP. But they don't necessarily address the issue of consumption because they are focused on these final stages of waste. There's also then some justice and equity issues involved, which Bea will expand on a bit more later. But essentially, if measures like taxation are implemented, this doesn't impact everyone equally because those well off are just able to pay for their pollution. Then there's command and control measures, and these are essentially non-market-based measures. And they incentivize circular economies through either administrative instruments such as bans, standards, or targets, or through informative instruments such as labels, certification, or information campaigns. And similarly, again, they each have their own advantages and disadvantages. So for example, bans on plastic bags can reduce the consumption of plastic bags, but it simultaneously can increase the reliance on the use of other resources. And there's an often cited study by the Danish Government Authority that concluded, for example, that paper bags are not necessarily better for the environment, depending on the indicators used. Though this comes with a slight caveat that it really does depend on the indicators you're looking at, because that study's also been criticized. And importantly, within this category is that many measures that can fall under it can equally hinder the circular economy. So for example, you can implement subsidies to support a circular economy, but subsidies exist for fossil fuels. And so that then goes directly against a circular economy transition. And then the final category is laws impacting circular economy. And this is really to highlight that even though our focus has predominantly been on environmental law and even specifically waste and resource law dimensions, the circular economy is much more than that. On Rosalind's slide, she highlighted the socio-technocratic dimensions, and that's what we have to remember when we are trying to transition to a circular economy. So these are just some areas of law that exist, and they all have impacts on or are impacted by the circular economy. For example, if we think about wanting to repair products, it's likely that there needs to be some more sharing of intellectual property to understand how repairs can happen, unless it's a very limited right to repair that exists. And so this is intellectual property rights law implications. When there's talk about the way we think about products and ownership, whether we should own products, lease products, share products, this is property law implications. And so in each of these other areas of laws, they need to be considered as well, because they all can help promote a circular economy or hinder a circular economy. And also what's important to note about these different categories of laws that exist across the circular economy and law is that there's no priority order. There's none that will affect the transition more on its own than others. It's essentially to point out lots of options exist and are being implemented, though none causing the systemic shift we need. What is needed is essentially an intricate puzzle of lots of different measures, because it's not surprising, because the circular economy needs to happen across lots of different types of sectors, using a diverse set of stakeholders, and also at different governance levels. That needs to happen internationally. Trade is international. It needs to happen at national level and subnational level. So this is just one way to think about circular economy in the law. The other way is to think about this life cycle approach that Rosalind has already shown. And it's an important consideration to think about what stage are the laws aimed at. And this matters because if you take action from the start at the upstream stage, then if consumption of resources are reduced, or then the use of materials is reduced and waste generation is reduced. This means that then the later stages become less of an issue. Yet when we actually look at the laws that are today being implemented to take action on the circular economy, they're most often aimed at the waste phase. And so again, this is too late, because at this point, the resources have been used, waste has been generated along the process, and we've not looked, as Rosalind pointed out, that the circular economy aims to do. So what are some of the measures that are particularly aimed at some of these stages? And I'll use plastics as an example to make the examples a bit more concrete. So at the upstream phase, the key activities include the extraction of fossil fuels to produce plastics, the use of alternative feedstocks for production, so to make biofuels, and the production processes of petrochemical industries producing plastics. So what is needed are measures that reduce virgin plastics, such as bans, harmonize standards for feedstock materials and quality, and incentives to use recycled plastic materials. And that means removing incentives that may exist for using fossil fuels. So, for example, removing fossil fuel subsidies. Again, these all come with warnings, and that's true at every stage. It's that there may be unintended knock-on effects of measures. So any measures that are implemented need to be carefully assessed. For example, if certain feedstocks are disincentivized, they may just be replaced by an alternative one that has different but equally detrimental impacts. Next is the midstream phase of the plastics life cycle, and these activities include the design, manufacture of plastic and plastic-containing products, the distribution and trade of plastics and products, and use and reuse. And again, there's lots of different measures that exist. You can implement design measures to eliminate or reduce harmful or unnecessary plastics, labeling systems to facilitate traceability. And this is really key because in order to facilitate reuse and recycling, those that want to reuse and recycle need to know what the product contains. So traceability is really key. And then finally, there's downstream. And this includes repair, refurbish, recycling, the trade of plastic waste, and the disposal of residual wastes. And measures that can be implemented include the right to repair. Again, the tracing is very important in order to help control illegal trade, and the use of targets. So for example, landfilling targets. And then finally, there are measures that I've mentioned a few times before, as well as other ones that can be used to incentivize change at different phases depending on how they're implemented. So for example, extended producer responsibility is a measure that aims to hold the producer responsible, as it's labeled, for a product. There's different ways in which this can be implemented. In practice, it's generally implemented as an economic responsibility, so where the producer essentially just pays to help with the waste management. So this is very much focused on downstream. But really the initial motivation for extended producer responsibility was to have the producer think about the design of products. If they were to take physical responsibility, were they to take a product back at the end of its life cycle, producers might be more incentivized in thinking about the particular resources used and the way in which they design their products. So returning to this, the headlines of the talk essentially, hopefully what you've taken away is that there's no single approach for the circular economy. Lots of options exist. There's lots of considerations and trade-offs that need to be considered of different measures. But it's likely that they're all needed in some sort of combination to affect the systemic change we need. And we need to consider the entire life cycle of products. We need to, as Rosalind said, essentially we're trying to make the concept of waste redundant. So we really need to shift our focus earlier in the life cycle. And then before I ask about questions and hand over to Fiea, just if you're interested in the circular economy, there's the Circus webinar series, and that's part of the research project I'm working on. And the next webinar is next Monday, and actually it's on one of these different areas of law, designing circular contracts, to consider what contract law in a way can, how contract law can help incentivize circular transitions. So I'll stop sharing. I'll put the link in the chat after. I'll stop sharing to see if there's any questions. I don't think so. So I'll move over, hand over to Fiea now, who will highlight some of the justice and injustice issues.
Stacey indicated in the chat that she has some questions. Stacey, do you want to ask any questions now or wait till after Fiea's talk?
Hi there. Hi. Thanks for acknowledging the comment. I think I'll wait. It's really an interesting presentation. It's fantastic. So I think I'll get more vision and some more insight, and possibly my questions will be answered in this upcoming.
Thanks,
Anyway.
Stacey. We'll come back and check with you after Fio's talk. Fio, you're muted.
Can you see it?
Ah,
Can you see my screen? Yep.
Yes, we can.
yes.
All right. Yeah. Okay. That's all I needed to know.
We can't see you though.
Oh no, yes, you did see me. Yeah. Where am I? Where am I? I'm somewhere. Oh yeah. Hmm. Oh no. I've vanished. Hmm. Do you need to see me? Hang on. Let me just.
I think you might need to come out of your presentation so you can click the camera
Yeah.
button.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find that. So yes, right. Hang on. There we go. Right. Here I am. Right. Do I need to share my screen again?
Yes.
Are we all good? Is that fine?
Yeah, good to go.
Okay, smashing. Right. Hello. So I'm following up, perhaps with the most sort of thorniest aspect of law and circular economy. In many ways, an area that it really has received very little attention. So I'm Dr. Fiona Leziewska. I work at University of Surrey as well. Recently joined. I was over at UCL before that in London. And like my colleagues, a lot of my research is like UK or EU based, but I have experience of doing research in China, Central and West Africa, and areas of Russia and Central Europe. So let me just get to my slides and move them. So yeah, I'm looking at the justice dimensions in circular economy laws, related laws, some of the areas that Katrine went over, but also thinking about the fact that we're addressing a transition from an existing economy which has significant justice aspects to it, and those justice aspects, as I will point out, are very historic and deep-rooted. So in the overview for the presentation, as has been laid out already, we've got a lot of direct, explicit circular economy laws, indirect, semi-direct, being adopted nationally, regionally, internationally, at all sorts of levels of governance, like Katrine was saying about the city adoption now with there's a London plan on circular economy and the Amsterdam plan, there's one in Glasgow, there's other cities around the world where circular economy as an entire kind of orientation for managing the development and growth of that city, also sort of within a sort of sustainability and net zero kind of framing as well. And there's actually a wide range of governance questions within the circular economy, but overarchingly, the way in which the circular economy is framed and discussed is about economic value within a very kind of Western epistemological notion of worth of materials. So it does, the language and the ideas pick up very much from lots of classical economic theory, and there is very little room for different ways of value and interpretation of the value of materials and where materials come from within the context of the earth. And finally, I'll be looking, the main point of this section is to consider justice dimensions, and I'll talk about those in more detail within relationship to what's known as the circular bioeconomy. My background is more under sort of research has been done on forestry and forest related issues, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about justice within the context of the circular bioeconomy and forest dimension of that. And the final bit, we'll talk about reparations. It's an area that myself and working with Katrine in the work that we did for our book, we didn't really cover reparations, but I've increasingly had an interest in where reparations fits within the sort of narrative to be developed on circular economy and justice, and why not including it is going to be problematic. So we've had kind of an overview of the main kind of goals of the circular economy, the sort of objectives, and in a very this is a classic image that's used, which is the butterfly image from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And it's all about closed loops, like keeping, as Rosalind was saying, keeping resources within a loop and ending waste, getting to this point of zero waste. And so it's very ideal that we get to have a sort of preventative economic model, a very systemic economic model. It would require, even if you don't pay any attention to justice, it would require significant intervention and rethinking of the policy that would underpin kind of the adoption of laws and regulations and standards in all areas of of the economy, from textiles, construction, chemicals, steel, all of these different areas. So it's no small thing in and of itself, but it's a very technocratic model, as Rosalind was saying. And it also is a model that we think of it within the concept of the individual producer, the context of a more local economic system, a national economic system, and then the transnational economic system, and then how all these things can interface with each other. So it's a huge, huge shift from where we're at. But there are limitations with the existing approaches already, and myself and Katrine produced a small paper which identified these, and that's accessible online. The ones I want to sort of hone in on here are the sidelining of justice dimensions, and the sort of flip side of that is a reinforcement of the status quo. And for me here, the status quo is the status quo of injustice. And we do cover this in a book that we produced earlier this year. It's not the definitive book on circular economy and justice. It's really just beginning to open up that conversation. And so we look forward to continuing that. And if any of you are interested, then getting in touch with us about work that you might be doing or intending to do, and would be interested to sort of get involved in our growing network. Now, a key figure in circular economy, and particularly thinking about the impacts of circular economy within a more sort of global south impacts, and particularly around sort of trade and value chains, is a guy called Patrick Schroeder, and he's at a place called Chatham House, which is a sort of very reputable international think tank based in London. And this is a really excellent image diagram about the fact that the circular economy is being constructed within and upon an existing economic order. And that economic order has historic origins of great violence, oppression, which have resulted in the legal aspects and elements that maintain the economic system that we have. So all the areas of law that Katrine was looking at, things like competition law and property law and intellectual property law, all these things, a lot of them have their origins within the sort of colonial system, the colonial trading system, the commercial dimensions of that, and the injustice of the extraction of materials and labor from peoples over 300-400 years is not recognized in discussions on transitioning to a circular economy. So the transition to the circular economy is about the transition to ensuring the materials become more circular, but not the economic order becomes more just and fair in a way that's inclusive. And this is a huge limitation of the current approach to even investigating the legal design towards a circular economy, in our opinion. So thinking about it within a circular economy, reconfiguring global value chains, for example. In the European Union, there's an initiative to increase the circularity of textiles, and it's pointed out that this will lead to 40,000 jobs. But the flip side of that is it will lead to 250,000 lost labour outside the European Union. And that's going to have implications for livelihoods, and particularly on women. So there's a sort of gender dimension, there's a distributional dimension, who was involved in making those decisions, recognition dimension, and participatory dimension. So, and we haven't sort of thought about sort of, what's driving this, which is a lot of this is also to do with the introduction of new technologies and digital production systems. And this is happening across all the different economic sectors, particularly in the global north and in countries like China, and a lot of interest in places like India. Now, in our work, we have adopted Schlossberg's framework of environmental justice as a sort of starting point. And again, I should say that our work is kind of at a relatively early phase for interrogating the way in which justice dimensions should be recognized, but then addressed. So Schlossberg basically sort of says that the distributive approach to equity and justice, which really sort of comes from sort of Rawlsian idea of distribution of sort of financial benefit, more equitably, but not completely equitably, is not sufficient to address environmental injustices. So there needs to be equitable distribution, not only of the benefits, but also the harms. So thinking about where the sacrifice zones are, who's had those historically over time as well. The recognition that there's a diversity of participants and that their identity and their knowledge systems and their language and their values need to be given the space within which to take part in the forming and framing and existence of a new economic order. And then you need the procedural space to be created for that recognition to be enacted within participatory processes and decision making. Now, all of this is kind of sort of like quite theoretical. How do you do that? How do we do that in practice? How do we do that in practice in the world that we face today? And obviously, I mean, you're all online somewhere, and your experience of the world and what it's like around you is going to be really different from where I am sitting in Surrey today, where it's so how we move forward is everybody's got different challenges, and that's not really recognised too much in the circular economy research so far. Now, when we come to, so I just want to sort of come to circular bioeconomy. Now, the circular bioeconomy is kind of seen as the regenerative dimension of the circular economy, that this is like the natural side of the circular economy, is that stuff can be taken from the sort of land and natural, forests, and it can be used, and then it can go back to the soils and it can regenerate. And you manage that entire system. And you manage it over and through a period of time with this concept of cascading. The cascading model is that you maximize the value of materials over a period of time. So you always extract and use the highest value of a material, and then the lowest value of the material before it ends up in the regenerative phase is where it would be lost. So this is where you would burn a material. And in forestry, that's biomass burning for energy. Now, the circular bioeconomy is being sold on this whole idea that it's extraordinarily valuable, that it has the potential of delivering $3.5 trillion and 87 million jobs, and this is the Centre for International Forest Research. And that this new circular bioeconomy can offer the opportunity to properly value nature and to forest systems and forest ecosystems. But the problem is that so much is being demanded of forests in our current era. So how do we maximize this value while meeting demands for carbon sequestration services within the Climate Change Convention, ecosystem services, if we think of that within the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, construction timber? UNEP came out with a report yesterday advocating the increase in use of timber-based products within construction to replace energy-intensive materials like cement. But then, is there going to be enough timber? We have the European Union, 60% of its renewable energy comes from the burning of biomass. Large amounts of that comes from outside the European Union, from healthy forests in North America. And then sort of demands to replace plastic packaging. Well, okay, is that going to come from some sort of woody biomass that's being reformulated and repackaged? Ensuring species have habitats. So all of these demands are being placed, but can they be realized effectively and properly to deliver and ensure that we have a healthy forest system? The likelihood is no. The difficulty is that the focus is in our discussion about forests is that we focus on the benefits of forests, but those benefits aren't shared because the harms from extraction are rarely kind of considered, particularly around loss of habitat and loss of land for indigenous communities and marginalized communities, the impacts on species, because mainly in the conversations, who are framing these conversations is state and businesses who are at the table. And the procedures, the legal procedures to realize these new markets are primarily using contracts and property law that have emerged from sort of colonial period, and using administrative and cadastral leases, which benefit those that have the most power. And we have a limited amount of impact from sustainability requirements and certification for the management of forests. And really underpinning everything is that we've had for historically, and again this moves into the justice frames, is historically forests have, since the sort of early colonial era, been seen purely as a resource. They have been seen as a source of making money or accessing land, taking the forest away, using that land for other purposes such as industrial agriculture. This happens within a spectrum of uncoordinated markets, so there's no hope of having a cascading approach, because you have to manage that, you have to intervene. And much of the ongoing attempt to even intervene continuates and perpetuates the sort of colonialist model by appropriating services, so carbon sequestration services being appropriated through contracts and then being sold on the carbon markets for offsetting. Again, this is a sort of obfuscation and greenwashing of what even is a circular bioeconomy. It completely undermines framings such as rights-based approaches, ecological integrity, indigeneity, and pluriverse kind of concepts, which would give us a much more rich and informed way of understanding how the bioeconomy could go forward. So finally, I just want to turn to the issues around reparations and justice in the circular economy. Now, reparations within the linear economy context are kind of gaining ground, I would say. There's more conversation about reparations. We've had reparation payments in some form or other being made by former colonial powers such as the UK and Germany, Germany to Namibia. There's pressure on the royal family in the United Kingdom now to potentially apologise for slavery and acknowledging their role in slavery. There's a document recently, report produced that highlighted that trillions of dollars were needed, or trillions of Great British pounds were needed to, as a beginning of reparations for slavery by the British state to the Caribbean nations. So there's a recognition of that, and then there's mechanisms of having an idea of a sort of global basic income as a kind of reparation to sort of equitable distribution of incomes and lifting people up from poverty, an idea of a birthright privilege levy, so that those that are born in developed countries would recognize that they have a privilege, and that privilege is built on historic extraction. So, but there's no conversation whatsoever. There's no discussion about reparations being incorporated into circular economy more generally and the justice narratives that we're talking about. So I think there's a really significant place to acknowledge that you're moving from one system, which was exploitative, contributed to injustice, and there needs to be some sort of reparation for that, into a new system. Why not make that new system the place where you design into that system reparatory justice through more equitable distribution? So, for example, if we're going to have leasing of services, the value of the leasing and the contracts is distributed more widely, that it doesn't just accumulate to companies that end up dominating the providing of those services, which we're already beginning to see, for example, with electric vehicles, leasing of electric vehicles. We saw it obviously with things like mobile phones. So that elite capture of the circular marketplace, we need to prevent that happening. We also need to prevent the exclusion and increased precarity of those that are already sort of within informal and vulnerable sort of economic systems as well. So there's a great deal to think about and talk about. And this was by no means meant to be the last word or anything. But we've gone through a lot in the space of our short presentations. So in the summary, just going back over the fact that what we have is what's already been presented by my colleagues. lots of laws, lots of action, lots of stuff happening. Although it may be happening in lots of different jurisdictions, the underlying thread about economic value remains one which is informed by Western epistemologies about what matters, what is value, very much orientated towards the sort of materialistic. And the sort of justice issues really are marginalized, and at the moment we don't really have a sort of discourse around sort of reparations and reparatory justice to recognize the historic contemporary inequities that have been perpetuated and we think will continue to be perpetuated if a circular economy doesn't grasp these issues from the outset. So yeah, that's it. I don't know how we're going to proceed. So this was a plan. We might just be going to an open kind of feedback and discussion group questions. I guess we need to, what's the plan?
I think just take questions, see if Stacey's come up with her questions, and then just have an open discussion.
Okay, so I need to stop sharing my screen, don't I? There we go. Okay, right.